establishment of power, it was automatically greater and lesser than. That was the immediate thought this being had as soon as he came into this existence. This is an unknown age of darkness. During this time, the reptilians, because of their suggestion, because other governments were then bound to their suggestion, and being in the midst of an all-out fake war, suggested the next concept. There was a system beyond the system, that all beings can know of that it present. Okay, basically what I'm saying is that everyone would know about the government, but they wouldn't know about the government beyond that government. Okay. Universal, okay. So that was present on, that was still present with government interests, etc. Universal telecommunicational services at that time. This system being the reptilians' ideas, and the First Order established that the systems and governments below were secluded from, and if to know about, would face consequences of that secret shadow government. Okay. Suggested. Okay. Now, hold on a second. Wow, there's so much here. Well, okay. The shadow government implanted many types of currency taxations that unfolded. Well, you know that history. The shadow government wanted to study gene splicing with other beings. Such concepts were not introduced. The reptilians gained popularity because of their new concepts. Scientists were around at that time. Their function was study of plant life on planets, certain effects and alterations they encountered. They were researchers. They were natural explorers, and they would document their findings. The shadow government at the time saw them as an asset to their studies. Their reasons at the time were particularly true. The search for a better and longer life. This saying has rang out in histories of histories, planet to planet, galaxy to galaxy, light year to light year. Gene modification became the next concept of interest, governments sharing such findings and research. They warranted their own test and trial with this concept. You can see now why so many ETs, of course, are aware of gene modification. It's a first, it's given, but you see why there's also an issue as well. The pursuance of a better life, of a better, longer life, as I put it. Okay, so chaos at this time and before was a misguided missile. This time was only around the time of the first established government, and during separation of the governments was assassinated by one of his own personnel. To kill them was always a means of another being interfering or being the root origin of such interference. Must remember, this was a time of still purity and honesty. This is why to this date there is that unmoving loyalty and dignity persons feel with their governments. That's going back to that. Realizing what you have heard, this speaks in volumes. I'm sure you have not yet come across in such magnitudes, yes. Because essentially, let's see, I need to backtrack a little bit. I'm gonna try my best to get through these distractions, but as long as they're pursuing, it's gonna, it's just gonna take a little longer than I would like. Okay. Now, at this time, I'm gonna clarify this. At the time, killing was extremely rare. Chaos had at one point became. There was, I would say, there was a bounty on him because he was very easy to find. He was very well known. He was the first that started the first of governments. He was assassinated. By whom? Don't know. But I would say that the person who assassinated him eventually, ironically, joined something that was of chaos. This was a very trivial time because it had only been recently that this being came out of nowhere, and it had only been possibly only a couple minutes at most in this universe's beginnings, and a being comes out of absolutely nowhere and starts relaying information that makes no sense to beings, And at that point, they're practically just, I mean, they're not worshiping this being, but looking at this being and going, oh my gosh, came out of thin air and is talking about stuff that isn't even in this universe. This is where your terms, God, Jesus, a lot of your religious terms come from. This being essentially came here with an idea, but the idea was based on experimentations, almost no means of certainty of what's going to happen. Very ungrateful being, a being that simply couldn't understand that his name was Chaos, but just because his name is Chaos does that mean you become Chaos, and that's essentially what happened. Okay, so now, moving on into the story. Okay, to kill then was always a means of another being interfering or being the root origin of such interference. Now the government, they had persons supporting the government. The people uprising did not mean killing, but it meant that the government's going to be removed and the people are going to be free. And if the government, while being removed, is still wanting to interfere, then yeah, that's what would happen. But see, at that time, there were massive gaps. There was partial gaps accumulating. Realization being the absolute death, not death itself, taking a life. Realization is the absolute. It is the ultimate. But the accumulations were gathering then, and it was already an unnatural start. So the variables, the uncertainties are just as high as the standards of potentialities. I would say hence the ramifications, but that's a long, long story. Okay. Must remember, this was a time of still purity and honesty. This is why, to this date, there is that unmoving loyalty and dignity persons feel with their governments. It's also hinting the origins of the story itself in the universe. Realizing what you have heard, okay, speaks in volumes of magnitudes that you didn't think of before, basically. Okay. Genetics. Better and lesser was obvious. The effects of certain beings meant that they are beings that could be ranked. The weaknesses of those beings were the lesser than the other being. It was basic. The issue truly surfaced when the reptilians found that certain alterations to genes could limit the being to such ways of amnesia. This is around the time when past lives of various other beings were surfacing. The process of realizing at that time was far quicker. The reptilians realizing their findings in beings able to comprehend and convey details of what was going on began to shift the war's direction. In other words, you had beings that were waking up and realizing, wait a minute, we have information that's tying back to the origins of this universe. I mean, that's how it began. A circular pattern of looking at how past lives work. If you go to the very beginning, your first past lives are going to be about your first experience. Your first experience is first before that life you just lived. So you're looking at beings that were literally within the maybe minute or few seconds of that universe's creation having the story. You're talking about a whole other set of jeopardizing government systems at that time. Beings were far more powerful than the government at that time. You will see the legs taken. Of course, you will see now this day it's ridiculous, but this story will allow you to understand why we are at where we are at now. Okay, I'm going to reread that last line. The process of realizing at that time was far quicker. Well, there was less going on. There was less ways of manipulating people. You can't just jump into a universe and just start the manipulation process immediately. It's impossible. Even Chaos himself couldn't do it and was assassinated. Of course, had other lives afterwards. Jesus being one of them. That being part of the T.P.W. though. And it's a very, very long story. All very, 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 very long story. Okay, so it was the process of realizing at that time was far quicker. The reptilians realizing their findings and beings able to comprehend and convey details of what was going on began to shift the war's direction. However, the government's voices at that time were heard far much more than particular beings whom could recollect near to origin information. These beings had followers, were rogue-like, and then formed an alliance with the truth, with other beings, not governments. To the government, they were an enemy. They targeted them with media propaganda. It was then that genetic modifications became public. The way it became public is a complicated matter of discussion. The basis of the idea was to introduce a better way of living and even a better physicality based on the conditions of war. Trachons being the first result of the gene modifications. That being either a certain type of gene splice with the reptilian, in various ways that could have happened. But they are one of the original results of the gene modification, which to everyone else it looked like a full metal jacket. Persons were very fearful of war, fear being new to them. In unnatural circumstances, it's even worse. But still, the circumstances then were a little more natural than unnatural. So you see beings looking at, from what a reptilian looked like to a draconian. You're going to see jaws drop, and you're going to see pens to paper and contracts written. Those who supported the government were asked to attend secret, quote, privileged meetings. They were asked discreetly to partake in a 100% successful genetic experimentation. It was successful. The difference was, though, other beings wanted such benefits. Now you can see where the story's spinning off from. You can see the barter epidemic would be very high. Currency back then were mostly focused towards war production, craft, weaponry, and newly installed research centers to benefit those who were lesser than other beings. Are you getting a Nazi Germany effect from this? Because you would be absolutely correct. See, if you look at the ironies of the past, you look at what's going on now, and you reverse it. It's not easy, but that's essentially what we're looking at. We're looking at the reversal. We're looking at perversion, not a fair system of tests and trials, and then the truth, open to you. But ironically, you will hear some light workers and other New Agers say that the government, this is just all a test. This is all to, do this and that. Pretty crazy, isn't it? Considering what you've just heard into that statement. Okay, bringing us to now, most ETs are looking for genetic correction, not so much as modification anymore, unless to help their situation, of course. It's apparent with near to all ETs, this history of genetic interest led up to the point of the Pleiadians not landing on Earth that could have, at absolute ease, a few to 3 years ago. But they have an interest in our genes, not knowing how to really go through with their plans, and they really are. They have the Galactic Federation of Light has a lot of recordings out there on YouTube, and they keep talking about how close they are. They really don't know what to do. They want our genes, but they don't know how to introduce the idea. Through their research, they eventually found how the mind worked. The reptilians became fascinated with their findings and tipped the scale of whatever purity they had left when they had decided to create mixed gene modifications with specific limitations unknowing to that being because of the information blackout at that time, aka war, aka I've never experienced fear, and it's scaring me. And you have the government, and other supporters of the government saying, get out there, they're giving weapons they've never been handled before. That's why if you are familiar with the First War, it is an all-out war, like literally all-out war. Like, no joke, everyone's at war. Everyone that is living is practically at war at that time. Okay, sticking with consistency here. It was war only then. Leading up to the next sentence, I guess. Not the concept of information. When there is an universal war, the need for knowledge is caught up in its own war. It was a clash of many concepts at that time. Reptilians' next concept was control, assess the situation, and maintain peace. Peace being the one word that did eventually simmer the war feud. You can understand why, and understand why they used peace very tactically. A lot of this you can self-stem and self-expand on. A lot of this is self-explanatory. It writes its own story. However, a slight boil down on the war, so there could be both the image of the government's making progress, because if there is no progress being made, then eventually the war is not even